And we are live. Hey everyone, I'm Alicia and this is Ellie and this is Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into Web3's building blocks. And on this episode, we are going to talk about the war for developers. And we have Maria Shen from Electric Capital, and she is the author of this report that was released recently, which is causing a stir all over Twitter. So yeah, let's dive into it.
Awesome. All right, yeah. So I guess we were going to have an icebreaker first. So the first icebreaker was going to be, what's your favorite chain or favorite app or anything that you've done recently in crypto that you're the most excited about? And I'll go first. I've been really into Farcaster for a long time and also Bounty Caster on Farcaster. So lately I did an Anon cast with a bounty in it that also was posted to Farcaster, and it was really fun. So that's what I did.
Ooh, that's awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, I can go next. I'm partial to Ethereum because it's what brought me into crypto. I heard about Bitcoin in 2013 and I don't think it quite clicked for me, but when Ethereum launched in 2015, this idea that you can actually write programs on top of money made a ton of sense. I was also getting my master's in computer science at the time. And so ended up exploring Ethereum. And so it's an ecosystem that's near and dear to my heart. I think anything that I built recently, I've been spending a lot of time on the developer report. So pretty proud of that. Pretty happy with that. Such a big team effort across everyone at Electric as well. It's always kind of like a scramble for the whole team to put it together. Things I'm excited to explore the next couple of weeks, though, now that I'm on the other side of the developer report, I'm going to explore AI agents and some of the ZK tech. We have a really cool section on how ZK is kind of coming out of research and getting applied more and more. And so that's one thing I actually kind of want to roll up my sleeves and explore.
Amazing. I definitely resonate with that programmable money concept because that's when I first got interested into Ethereum. And I think as of recently, I've been doing a lot of cross-chain stuff. So looking into like canonical bridge contracts with Arbitrum. So I've found that really exciting. In general, my favorite application is DeFi, and I have done a bit of ZK stuff as well. So all of the things I saw in the reports, I'm like, yep, I agree. Makes sense.
Great. Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So maybe we can start with, like, we've all looked at the report of like, what was our initial reactions when we saw the report? For me, I actually thought like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. But given the trends that we've seen, I can see how Solana has grown in developers. I can see how ZK is a really popular technology. So, overall, I wasn't surprised, but maybe you guys were.
Should I go if I was surprised?
Yeah, go ahead.
I definitely was. I think very similar to you, Ellie. A lot of it, it didn't feel like it was coming out of nowhere. Certain trends like Asia is now the #1 continent for crypto developers. It was a shock to see that number, but then, when you pause to think about it, you're like, oh, well, is it that crazy? Like, no, these are trends that we've been seeing for some time. So things that were kind of shocking to see confirmed, I suppose, were Solana leading in new developers, Asia's #1, India's #2, and the kind of increasing slope for India is also very remarkable, right? They were #10 in 2015, and now they're #2. A couple other things, the US continuing to lose developer share. That's just been a trend for the past couple of years. I think also not so shocking to see, but maybe just kind of sad to see. But on the flip side, very cool to see crypto decentralizing to other places in the world now and so many different regions of the world participating.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Seeing Solana having the most attraction for new devs was definitely interesting to me because graduating from university, most people don't know Rust. And of course, most people don't know Solidity. And of course, Web3 is popular. So maybe when people first decide to build in Web3, they think they need to learn Solidity. So it's really interesting that developers are choosing to build on Solana, and Solana requires Rust. And I saw that Stack Overflow also had a developer survey, and apparently Rust was one of the most desirable languages. So it may not be that people are building in it. So perhaps developers are seeing that, okay, I can build in Web3. Web3 is very exciting, and I can learn Rust at the same time. So that could be one reason why developers are choosing to build on Solana. And I wonder if we'll start seeing that same thing happening in the EVM chains that allow for Rust, for example, Arbitrum Stylus. But I definitely was completely surprised that Solana was a #1 chain, because I personally haven't built on Solana. When I go on their website, on their docs, I don't necessarily feel super motivated to build there. But clearly, that's
#1 for new developers, by the way. Ethereum ecosystem is the biggest ecosystem, but Solana is the biggest ecosystem for new developers right now.
Right. So what?
Go ahead.
No, go on, Ellie.
All right. So I think maybe this is a good segue into discussing the nuances between developers in the Ethereum ecosystem versus EVM developers, and maybe Solana developers versus just SVM developers, because I think there's an important difference there, and they're not exactly always the same group of people.
Oh yeah, they're
elaborate.
Very different. I think of it as maybe 3 tiers. There's Ethereum mainnet, sort of the Ethereum L1. There's the Ethereum ecosystem, which includes Arbitrum, Optimism, Base, all of these L2s that settle onto Ethereum or borrow their security from Ethereum. And then there's EVM. EVM does not necessarily have anything to do with Ethereum, other than the fact that it just kind of shares the VM. And so that one has Ethereum, its L2s, but then also has ecosystems like Polygon and Avalanche, and the list goes on. So that's a much, much bigger ecosystem, where really the whole idea is just the Solidity code can kind of go back and forth on different chains. And then similarly for Solana L1, and then now there are, SVMs as well, very new emerging thing. And so for most of the report, we're really talking about Solana, the L1.
Yeah, because I was thinking when I first saw, so I think the reports, there's about like 1,200 more new developers on Solana than there were Ethereum, which I did the calculation, and it's almost like 18% more than Ethereum had. And I'm wondering, to me, it seems maybe really logical that Rust is a very popular language. I myself code in Rust. And so maybe the drive to Solana is because people really like using the SVM. There could be other reasons too, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's a big part of it.
I see 2 reasons for this, and one has to do with why Solana is doing so well with new developers, and one for why Ethereum, just from a methodology and accounting standpoint, seems to not be doing so well with new developers. So I think part of this is just this is our 6th year doing the report, so I end up talking to a lot of developers, crypto developers over the years, just in terms of, how did you get involved? How did you pick whatever chain you picked when you first started? Most of it is really not language related. I haven't spoken to a developer who's like, oh, you know what, I know this language and that's why I got into it. A lot of it has to do with the support that the ecosystem gives you, where the users are. I think where the users are is often cited. Where my friends are building, like what I heard about first. I think developers aren't afraid to try out new languages, although, the barrier to entry for Rust is a little bit higher. I think they're generally not afraid to try new languages, and most of it has to do with really the kind of softer parts of the ecosystem, the support, the users, even like the ease of getting in terms of like developer documentation and things like that. So I think, in general, just having seen the Solana DevRel team work, they're very, very good. And they've done a phenomenal job onboarding new developers. So I think that's part of it. That's like #1 is I think Solana DevRel team does a phenomenal job. But the second part of it is I actually think Ethereum's new developer accounting kind of loses a little bit because of pure like accounting reasons. So the most hackathon participants, if you look at, again, a lot of new developers are hackathon participants, which is why, I'm focusing there now. A lot of hackathon participants, if you look at them who are building for EVM is actually launching on a bunch of chains at the same time. They're not really saying like, hey, I'm just going to build one thing for Ethereum mainnet. And so there's this kind of like dispersion effect, right? Just because EVM has these great network effects and people can build for a bunch of chains, that's what a lot of hackathon participants end up doing. And our methodology actually says, hey, if you're building for more than 10 chains, we're not going to count you as a developer for any of these 10 chains because it doesn't seem like you have any intent of furthering, if you're building for 10 chains, it doesn't feel like you have any intent of furthering any particular one chain. It really feels like you're here to further like, EVM or whatever that ecosystem is. So Ethereum loses out a lot because of that, because people add Ethereum mainnet kind of as one of many chains that they're working on. And so that's another reason why kind of Ethereum gets bumped down a little bit, even though there are still a lot of new developers building for Ethereum mainnet, just not really exclusively for Ethereum mainnet.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe Alicia, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I was just thinking for the report, if the report was written such that we said EVM versus Solana, then I wonder if we would see more new developers building in the EVM, because right now it's Ethereum versus Solana.
Yeah, exactly. But also like, I agree. I think if we did EVM versus Solana, it would be maybe a slightly different picture. I have to go back and look. But it also is a little bit of an apples and oranges comparison. But yeah, I think Ethereum does have this really, really nice network effects with the EVM. I think somewhere in the report, let me see if I can find it. We reference how, what was it, 74% of multi-chain developers work on at least one EVM chain. So EVM really dominates any developer mindshare if they're working for multiple chains. And then EVM is the number one tech stack. It's bigger than SVM is the next biggest, and it's bigger than the SVM by 3.6x. We'll kind of see what happens. SVM is really just starting, and so we'll see what happens in a year or two from here.
Yeah. I mean, I think personally, I would argue if you are building in the EVM, like on an EVM, not necessarily Ethereum, somehow you have chosen to build in this ecosystem because you want to leverage Ethereum. You want to leverage the fact that Ethereum has been around for a while. People are seeing it as the settlement layer. So even if you are building on an L2, even if it's a ZK L2, like as tech, you are still ultimately building for the Ethereum ecosystem.
We do count L2s as part of the Ethereum ecosystem. Okay. Yeah, we just don't count, Polygon developers, for example, or Avalanche developers as part of the Ethereum ecosystem.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to a point you said earlier, which you talked about how much support like new developers have in the Solana ecosystem. And this has kind of made me think how, people talk about like, oh, Ethereum needs to compete with Solana. But I was kind of thinking, well, it's Ethereum and their L2s. And I particularly noted that Base, Jesse from Base does so much, like I think he retweets like every single app that gets deployed on Base. And they had a lot of new developers this year as well. And they had like I think the most code innovation, at least across the Ethereum L2s.
Yes.
So to me, it almost kind of seems like, well, maybe Base is like what we have that can kind of match some of the Solana level of developer engagement.
Yeah, I actually love that you brought that point up. This is kind of the working theory that I have in my head as well, is that Ethereum is really good for certain use cases. Specifically, it's very, very good for high value use cases. But when it comes to these low fee, high scale use cases, mainnet doesn't do so well. But that's fine. I don't think that's like a secret, right? That's why there's this kind of L2 scaling strategy. And Ethereum is really capturing a lot of these new use cases through its L2s. Notably, I think in this report, just looking over 2024, Base obviously captured a lot of that. And so I think that is really interesting. If you look at some of these low fee use cases like NFT mints, Base captures 97, let me just make sure. Yeah, 97% of volume, minting volume is happening on Base. And then when you look at like minting transactions, the two biggest are Solana and Base. And so, Ethereum as an ecosystem is able to capture both the high value use cases, but then also low fee scaled use cases through its L2s.
Yeah, and it makes sense to me saying that a lot of these L2s, they have more of a face to them. Like they have like a single company or foundation that's associated with them. So it's a lot easier for them to have these like closer relationships with developers than maybe Ethereum, which is this decentralized organization, and it's more difficult to get that.
Yeah, I mean, pros and cons, I think,
Yeah.
of just high decentralization.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alicia.
Yeah, I think on that same point that you mentioned, India has onboarded the most new crypto developers since 2023. And I am aware that Solana does have a strong base in India. They have something called Super Team, and they have it all around the world, UK, Dubai, India. And it's the same thing you were saying, Maria, that the community support, like if there's someone there to guide you and show you what you can build, how to build, why you're building it, it makes it so much easier, because I still think that Web3 is very esoteric for some developers, even if they are a developer. Like my friends who work at Google and Amazon, they don't really care necessarily to build in Web3. But I reckon if you have someone actually showing them and explaining how it works, taking away the noise that you hear in the media, then they would be more interested to build. So when you have these thriving community efforts, that really helps developers on board as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it also ends up being, again, just talking to a lot of crypto developers. I think you end up developing where you form like a network or a tribe as well. And so if you actually, a lot of developers form real friendships with other people in the ecosystem. And I think that also causes you to stay, right, and to retain in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I'm not sure if the report touches on this, but Maria, you mentioned that Rust definitely has a higher, push for you to get started with Rust. Is not as easy as Solidity. Solidity is like a scripting language, so it's a lot easier for people to understand if they have a Java background or a JavaScript background. But Rust is definitely a different way of programming. So I wonder, for the people who did start as a new developer building in Solana, how many of them actually continued building as the year went on compared to new developers in Ethereum? Like, do they continue building in Ethereum? Do Solana developers eventually just tail off because they're like, bro, what is this?
What an excellent question. I think that's also like a part of a nuance that gets really hard to parse without having a discussion about it, is what does it, how important are new developers? What does it mean to have new developer exposure? I think new developers are important, but at the end of the day, it's like a top of funnel, right? Like new developers are your top of funnel. And at the end of the day, you want to see how many developers are really pushing your ecosystem forward. How many are building the tooling? How many are building the apps on a consistent basis over years, over price cycles, and all this shenanigans that goes on in crypto. And only time will tell. I think it's a really great start that Solana has so many new devs. As it stands right now, Ethereum has, I was calculating this before the podcast, but 35% of Ethereum's developers are full-time. And keep in mind that Ethereum still has and when I say Ethereum, I mean Ethereum ecosystem. So Ethereum mainnet plus all its L2s is still the biggest ecosystem in crypto, with over 6,000 monthly active developers. 35% of them are full-time. Full-time meaning that in a 28-day period, you're committing 10 or more days. So you're consistent. 18% of Solana's developers are full-time. And full-time developers are really important because, not only are you committing more consistently, you're pushing most of the code. Your code is probably this is, subjective and maybe speculative, but your code might be a little bit more high quality. I went through, thousands maybe of hackathon repos, just literally clicking in and looking at the files, and a lot of it is copy paste, right? It's not a bad thing. It's just when you're getting started, you're using a scaffold that already exists. And so, there is this question of who's writing really original code, who's writing new things that can push the ecosystem forward. And I think that's why it's really important to look at metrics like full-time developers.
Yeah, one question I was curious about was that the Ethereum ecosystem had an increase in established developers. and then like a decrease in new developers and then emerging developers. And I was curious, how many of those emerging developers actually, that decrease was because they became established developers?
Yeah, basically, when you see a decrease in emerging, it kind of means that some decrease because they became established, but the number of new developers that converted over to emerging was not enough to fill the gap, basically. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And established is another. So established developers, meaning developers who are active for 2 or more years in that ecosystem. Another really important metric that we look at because I want to say something like 70% of code overall is written by established developers. So again, these are people who have been here for a really long time, are here and they're consistent, and they, again, they're kind of the ones pushing things forward.
I think what I really liked about seeing that metric is a signal to developers who perhaps are existing developers in other spaces, in AI and databases, etc., to know that you can work in Web3 and you will be able to sustain a job in Web3 over the years. For example,
Yes.
like when I first started to work in the blockchain space, I was working at a Wi-Fi company, and my manager was like, "Girl, like if you need a job in 6 months, don't worry, you can come back." And that was since 2018. So safe to say I've been here for a while.
Yeah.
But definitely, I think there is a bit of a fear. Like in the tech space in general, there have been a lot of job layoffs. And of course, that happens in the blockchain space too. But people are very cautious about switching careers because they worry that they will be able to maintain and be retained as a software engineer. So I think that's a really great start. So developers know, like, look, if you build in Web3 and if you like it and you're passionate and you're good, you can definitely continue building, and there's a demand. So that was a great start for me. It was reassuring.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't thought about reading the numbers that way, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I don't know if the report said which ecosystem was retaining these developers, the ones who were long-term developers. Did it say that? I'm not sure.
No, we don't have a metric for that, but I think that's really interesting. Like we could just do a ranking of who has percentage-wise the highest percentage of full-time developers, and that would be really interesting.
Right. Nice.
Maybe switching gears a little bit. Another thing that I thought was a little bit surprising in the report for me is how much DEX activity happens on Solana. I would have thought a lot more happened in Ethereum, but the vast majority happens on Solana, and I think that's quite interesting.
Well, I would put DEX transactions in this sort of like fee sensitive or like low fee use case, right? Where people really aren't looking to pay a lot. And so it would make sense that if we look at the share of DEX transactions, number one is Solana. 81% is coming from Solana. So it's kind of like hands down. And you have the slide here, which is 1.7 million unique wallets. And this is a number that actually removes some like wallets that have done only one transaction of value under $1. So this is kind of filtered against what we kind of think of as noisy wallets.
Yeah.
But 81% of DEX transactions come from Solana. The next biggest is Base, but again, at 81%, it's not it's not competitive. And I mean, I would say a lot of that also comes from the meme coin activity that's been happening this year. And so it makes sense that a lot of that is happening on Solana.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this is the year of accepting memes. I think everyone, no matter if they're a developer or someone in the BD space, they definitely have accepted and welcomed memes. And that is definitely what's been happening on Solana. Every time I see a meme coin that's pumping, I'm like, okay, hopefully this is on ETH or Polygon. And I check and it's on Solana and I'm like, okay, of course. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if that even is also part of the reason why new developers are choosing to build on Solana, because they want to build where they think the users are. And they are, of course, seeing people on Solana. So that would be a good incentive as well.
Yeah. I mean, with all these ecosystems, I think it's, kind of just taking a step back on this like Ethereum versus Solana debate. Ethereum has been around for such a long time and it has such a dedicated developer base. I don't think it's going anywhere. And narratives will kind of come and go, but it feels like Ethereum at this point has a strong enough network effect and has enough dominance to stay. I think Solana is definitely winning from the meme coin narrative this year, but also it went through a really, really tough time in 2023, where I think the reason it was able to come back is because it had so many dedicated developers that when most people left and, when prices were super depressed, they kept on building. And that actually ended up creating a very strong ecosystem, a very strong tribe at the end of that.
Yeah. So do you think that a developer, like if I were a developer today and I'm choosing to build in a Web3 space, should I build an Ethereum in the Ethereum ecosystem, or should I start off with Solana?
It's a really good question. I think it probably, I talk to a lot of new developers now, and the sort of chain loyalty that used to exist, it feels much weaker now than before. I think a lot of people are willing to launch on many chains, right? And we see this in the report as well, in this rise of multi-chain developers who are working on many chains. Obviously, there are a lot of developers working across EVM chains, and I think that's just the ease of being able to switch around. And so that's what often pulls in a new developers is they'll say like, hey, maybe I built something on Base, but that can also be repurposed and used across like all these other chains. Solana is kind of starting to build up that ecosystem with the SVM. But yeah, I think a lot of developers are probably going to be supporting multiple chains just based on the handful of conversations I've been having so far.
Okay. So it's not a cause for concern then.
Well, I do think, I do think the Solana DevRel team has been doing a phenomenal job. And I think there's a lot of education that can still happen for new developers for the Ethereum ecosystem. And so, I do feel like this is a good time for us to realize that, there could be a lot more ways that the Ethereum ecosystem could pull in new developers.
One thing is that overall, the monthly active developers were down, even though we did see still like many new developers. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why that is. Like my initial thought would be that it's associated with price, but maybe you have more thoughts on that.
I generally when developers really grow, it's because of new developers, and new developers are generally a lagging indicator from price. If you graph the monthly active, like monthly new developers joining crypto with the monthly price charts, it like matches almost exactly, right? In the sense that like developers are shifted over a little bit from when prices rise. I think that actually has a lot to do with how often crypto gets talked about when prices are high. It's just, if you are a developer, it's not necessarily you're here chasing money, but it's more just, it appears on the news so much more. It's much more a topic of discussion. It's much more likely that you say, hey, what am I doing this weekend? Oh, like crypto's in the news again. Let me kind of pop back in to see what's happening. And so new developer activity is definitely downstream of that. I think the simple explanation, you're right, is that we have kind of like this flatter, it fell 7%. And so very, very slight decline. But a lot of that is because we don't have as much new, compared to previous, compared to like 2022 or 2021, we don't have as many new developers. That being said, we still had over 39,000 new developers explore crypto, which I think is actually the other remarkable thing is I guess like the height, or like how momentous the number of new developers come in has a lot to do with prices. When prices are high, we kind of get this like rush. But when prices are low, it's not like no one's coming, right? It's not like no one cares about crypto when prices are low. You actually still get a very, very steady stream of developers popping their heads in and exploring. That's what I find really cool is is that it's kind of like, you know, rain or shine, developers are coming. On sunny days, there are more developers. And then the other really cool thing is if you look at monthly active new developers over time, the baseline for how many new developers come in a month increases. So meaning that in you know, at the peak of 20, so we are more monthly active new developer, more monthly new developers are coming into crypto now than at the peak of 2028. Meaning that, you know, every bull market kind of creates this new baseline for how many new developers are coming in. And so over time, we are growing our overall developer share that way.
This makes me curious. Do you know like what kind of developers are becoming new developers? Because like, are they people who already have software engineering jobs, or are they people who are actually just very new to coding? My guess would be that it's actually a lot of people who are very new to coding, because you can copy and paste, or there's a lot of things like you can very easily make your own ERC20 token. But I'm curious if that's actually the case.
That's a really good question. I don't have any data to back that up one way or the other. I think anecdotally, I do see a lot of devs who have like previous GitHub activity, you know, before they join crypto, suggesting that, I don't know how many years of experience they necessarily have, but suggesting that, you know, they're not kind of learning development through crypto. It's usually like step 2.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's good to see that developers are curious to build in Web3. And I think the whole Solana versus Ethereum thing, I also wonder the diversity of apps that people are building. Like if you're building in Ethereum, Ethereum has been around for a while. So you're going to see restaking apps, you're going to see ZK, you're going to see DeFi. Whereas in Solana, I would only assume that it's mostly DeFi people are building across there. Have you been able to see or get any insight on that?
There are a lot of cool things on Solana. It still spans. I mean, you can see from the NFT activity on Solana that there is quite a bit of, you know, NFT activity, and NFTs now also don't just mean art or collectibles. Like people are using them in all sorts of use cases, like identity and badges and loyalty points and things like that. A lot of, you know, some of the AI stuff is happening. AI agent stuff is happening on Solana as well. I think I actually do see like quite a wide variety of different types of applications happening on both. It would be really, you know, I think analysis that would be really cool is to, and unfortunately I don't know how this would be possible, would be to do the same sort of like code innovation analysis across all chains, not just EVM. You know, in EVM you can see that most of the new code is happening on Base now, which is fascinating. But yeah, it would be really cool to, you know, to somehow be able to kind of compare that again around against all the chains.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, oh, sorry, Ellie, go on.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking like cross-chain activity, like this is a Composable podcast, so we care a lot about what's happening across chain and multi-chain. And it would be so interesting to learn from developers who are building, especially the multi-chain devs, like, are they leaving any ecosystem because of the lack of cross-chain support? Because right now, the cross-chain support, like you do have ways that you can have cross-chain activity. For example, there might be a canonical bridge contract on a platform, but I'm not too sure how that works in every single like ecosystem in the Ethereum ecosystem, like Arbitrum across Optimism, etc. And then there's also Solana. So I'm wondering like if developers are getting frustrated, or if right now they're just happy, like, okay, I'll deploy my app on Polygon, and then I'll deploy my app on Arbitrum, and then I will eventually learn Rust and deploy it on Solana. I would love to get some feedback on that. I'm curious if you've had any conversations that would help share some insight on that.
On the question being, do developers feel more frustrated if there's not enough kind of cross-chain support for these ecosystems? Yeah, it's such a good question. I think it's a question of where the expectations are. When I talk to developers who are building on an EVM chain, I think there is a lot of frustration, right? Where it's like, well, like the expectation is that you should be able to bridge things and you know, things move around a little bit easier. But I don't talk to people who are building on Solana who are like, ugh, you know, like why isn't interoperability working with other chains? I think it also has a little bit to do with expectations. But that being said, you know, again, back to this conversation of like, where are new developers building, and are they feeling like how weak or strong are these, like, this sense of needing to stay on one chain? It feels like it's I mean, it's certainly, again, kind of, this is like a finger in the wind analysis, but I joined crypto full time in 2018, and in 2018 it felt like there were lines you did not cross, right? You pick an ecosystem, you stick with it, and like you don't talk to people in the other ecosystems. And now it certainly does not feel that way. And I think that, and you can kind of see that from the developer numbers and the trends, and that like the number of monthly active multi-chain developers has only been growing. And now 1 in 3 crypto developers are multi-chain. And so I think the reality is that multi-chain is here, it's here to stay, it's probably going to grow. And I think right now, maybe we don't have the same amount of expectations for every ecosystem in terms of like how easy it is to, you know, to port things over, for messages to get passed, for tokens to be able to cross over. But I think that expectation is only going to grow over time.
Yeah, I guess I thought that I was thinking, at least with the EVM, maybe in some way the EVM kind of is suffering from its own success, and that it's becoming easier and easier to just like copy and paste applications across chains. So you really don't have to do a whole lot of development. So deploying to like Ethereum plus 5 EVM L2s is actually quite easy.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, and this is again why the kind of like the code innovation is really fascinating to see for EVM, because it is so easy to copy and paste. And by the way, I also want to highlight that copy and paste is not a bad thing. Like, how much faster can we develop now that you don't have to, you know, like if you want to build a DEX, no one is like, oh my gosh, like go back to basics and like rebuild everything. It like actually speeds up the development timeline to be able to kind of copy paste something, to fork something, but also it's better for security, right? These are contracts, and these are code bases that have been around and have been vetted for years. And so if you are reusing pieces of it, there's a lot of kind of built-in security in that as well. And so I think that's another really positive thing for the EVM, is because it's so easy to borrow pieces of code, you probably get higher security, right? And development happens faster because you can get over the basics and the foundations faster.
Yeah, I really like that point.
Yeah, I guess, and it kind of matches when I think about composable things. So, you know, on Ethereum, apps are all composable because they can automatically interact with each other. But I think you have a really good point. It would be really, from my point of view, it's like really interesting if you can have these composable experiences across chains, where instead of having a new application deployed on each chain that has to have some sort of DevOps with it, et cetera, you can just access the other chain's application that's already been like running for 2 years and you know is secure and it has a ton of liquidity in it. I guess my point here is that, yes, I think that the composability and the cross-chain stuff is important, and I'm excited to see how it plays out.
Yeah. I mean, I could say Ellie and I are definitely Ethereum ecosystem girlies, but one point I would say for Solana is definitely, if I were a new developer, and let's say I was a new developer, but I'm an experienced developer. So I know a lot about code complexity. I know a lot about libraries and all that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to choose where I would like to build. I don't care who even uses it. I just want to build. I might choose Solana off of the principle that I don't have to think about L2s. I don't have to think about interoperability across chain, especially if I'm thinking that Solana has a great user base. So I think that's one thing about Solana that I personally want to investigate. I haven't built there, but I would love to learn more about how smart contracts interact with each other. And if there were to be Solana L2s, if that ever were to exist, like how easy would that ecosystem thrive? Because I think the overhead of which chain do I build on, I hear developers talking about that. I hear people who have product ideas wondering, that's the last thing they have to figure out. Like, where do I deploy this product that I would like to build?
Yeah. How did you two get into the Ethereum ecosystem, by the way? I'm very curious. Why was that the ecosystem you all landed in?
So I landed in that ecosystem. I thought Bitcoin was really cool, But I was like, the ability to write arbitrary code logic is like, that's a game changer. And so therefore to me, Bitcoin was like, I'm all in Ethereum with smart contracts. And yeah, that's what did it for me.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it was the same for me at the time when Bitcoin was, I guess you'd say, becoming popular. I remember students in the computer lab were getting into trouble because they were mining Bitcoin on the computers. So I associated Bitcoin to be a negative thing. But yeah, and it was for a very simple reason. I'm like,
that's what the bad kids did.
Yeah, that's what the bad kids do. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use the university's resources for this. But then eventually I did learn about Ethereum and the fact that you can build apps on top of it. And I think that just made more sense for me because I wasn't necessarily someone who was paying attention to finance. I wish I was, though. But yeah, and then at that time, there were Ethereum meetups because I was in London at the time. So there were Ethereum meetups that you can go to. So again, it's like that comes back to that community aspect. There was some form of a community there, of course, not as mature as now, but it just made it easier. And then by the time L2s came around and DeFi summer, it was just, there were so many things happening. The hype was there, people were there, the transaction activity was there. So
yeah, I think that's also this kind of like, why are there so many new developers in Solana? I think it's also a fact of just crypto maturing overall, right? And crypto maturing and diversifying. I think that was like, diversification was really a huge theme this year for me as I was working on the report, looking at the number of developers that are now global, and we're really diversifying geographically, but we're also diversifying across chains. I remember talking to developers, did a bunch of interviews last year, and for developers who have been around for a while, I really asked them this question of like, oh, if you're in Ethereum, like, how did you end up in Ethereum? Thinking that there would be some sort of like really insightful, like, oh, I did this analysis and like I compared across chains. I remember so many people are like, oh, I thought it was like wasn't that like the only thing available at the time, right? That was like the only thing we could build on. And yeah, I remember one developer was telling, she started in high school, and she was saying like, I didn't even know there was like other chains you could build on. It was just Ethereum. So it's not, I think the landscape has changed and crypto has matured, and there are these other mature chains that developers can try if they're new, that has a lot of I think a big part of it is honestly like, how many resources on like, how many YouTube videos do you have, right? On like, if you were to look up like, hey, I want to get started on crypto, like how many of those resources exist? And the majority of those, I think for a very long time was really Ethereum focused. And now I think there's more and more and more content for new developers on some of these other chains as well.
Yeah. And given you, Maria, so given your expansive knowledge of the entire blockchain ecosystem, not just Ethereum, and also having a background in engineering, if you were to start today and you would like to build apps in Web3, which ecosystem would you choose to build on first?
I think I would probably try to build something in the Base ecosystem. Okay. And the reason for that is it's hard to just like, kind of come in and pretend like I don't have any knowledge, but like my sense is, my rationale would be, hey, if I'm building on Base, if I want to kind of pick up and go to access users on another chain, that's really easy to do because it's an EVM. If I want to kind of expand this to mainnet later, I can do that. If I want to expand to Arbitrum, I can do that. And it kind of like puts me very close to a bunch of other ecosystems and user groups that I can tap into. Base also just seems like it's at a point where it has a lot of fun experimentation, and it's very welcoming of experimentation. And I'm always a fan of that, of just like totally new, crazy things happening. And so to me, I think if I put on the lens of, if I'm new and I'm experimenting and I'm looking for places that are very amenable and very friendly towards experimentation, but still lets me kind of like get into a bigger ecosystem, Base feels like the chain for that.
Okay. I like that.
What about you, Alicia?
So I have a slide here that I'll show. But for me, I think I will still choose to build within the Ethereum ecosystem. Transparently, I don't know which L2 I would choose, and it probably depends on which hackathon I went to recently and who was just the loudest at the hackathon. And the reason why I would choose to build in the Ethereum ecosystem is because of this. The fact that Ethereum is still used for larger transactions or larger sizes of value being transferred. And if I want to build an application that has to create impact, I would imagine that something that's transacting large value, like let's say real estate on chain, would be very exciting for me. There's an argument for small transactions as well, especially when it comes to development in like apps that are being used in underdeveloped countries where they are just using it for quick payments. So there is a good argument for being able to transact very small transactions as well. But I think right now the things that really excite me are like RWA, real world assets on chain. So I think just based on that, I probably would choose the ecosystem where people are doing like big, serious transactions. But I am, I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I would have the same answer for mostly the same reasons. But another thing people have been talking about is Solana has been more welcoming to new developers, and I think that that's interesting because I felt like when I joined Ethereum, it was very welcoming to new developers, and so maybe it's just a part of Ethereum aging. But yeah, I think I would also choose to build in the Ethereum ecosystem. I would probably deploy on Ethereum first, and then I think Base would be my next
mainnet
chain.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's also, I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about is the barrier to entry for deploying on mainnet. Much lower now. But again, this like high school developer I was talking to who, well, when I was talking to her, she was no longer in high school, but she was in high school when she first started. And it was, height of the bull market. And she said to deploy on mainnet, she had to get together like $200. And she was like, what? $200? Like, where am I going to get $200? Like, that's crazy, right? And so, I think just a lot of these like L2s lowering the barrier for even just working in the ecosystem is just so valuable.
Was there anything that surprised you, Maria, in the report? Like from once you were done with the report?
I think it really like kind of what came out of it or just areas I'd want to explore a little bit more. The things that surprised me, I mentioned are just like the geographic shift from North America, Europe to Asia, this sort of overall diversity, whether it's diversity to other chains or diversity globally. Maybe the other one is kind of this rise of low fee use cases and what feels like maybe like chains are now like different chains are tailored to different use cases, right? Like Base is good for low fee use cases, Solana is good for low fee use cases, things like that. But yeah, I mean, I came out of it really wanting to explore ZK a little bit more. Again, like back to this section on ZK and just seeing the growth there. It's a very, very small number of contracts being deployed. Like in absolute numbers, still like small number of contract deployers, but just, it's kind of straight line up, right? And more and more people are experimenting. And so it feels like this like new frontier that, that is still like open for innovation. I think people haven't really figured out what the different use cases can be. And so it feels a little bit more like there's a frontier there.
Maybe, maybe now is a really good time. If we've been talking for almost an hour, we should kind of say what our predictions would be for next year's report. And maybe Maria, you can go first.
I'm expecting more new developers, kind of back to our discussion on like this sort of like price and new developer relationship. I'm expecting more new developers. I think it's up to crypto as an ecosystem to see how well we can convert them into full-time and convert them into developers that stay for the long term. That's probably, that's an easy prediction to make. I wonder maybe another one is how much AI is going to kind of like become a new section of the report. I think a lot of the kind of experimentation in AI agents is pretty cool. The problem being that I feel like a lot of that exploration is probably not open source. And so it's harder to track through a report like this, which only looks at open source developers, but we'll see.
What about you, Alicia?
Yeah, I think I suspect that seasoned developers who've been here for like 2 years plus, if they're not already building in Solana, they will start building in Solana, because I think when they see results like this, they themselves will get curious. I mean, I am curious. So I think we'll start seeing that shift. But then I also think people who have been building in Solana would probably realize, like, okay, I understand Web3 now. I was a new developer last year. Let me learn more about these other ecosystems that I know are quite popular, like Ethereum and Base. So I think we will start seeing a transfer like this. And in terms of ZK, I personally really love and I'm really excited about. And that one is a bit more difficult for the everyday developer to build in, I think, because when it comes to like building a privacy application, you have to think about, okay, well, what are the regulations? Can this particular app exist? So I think I'm really curious to see what comes out of that and what app use cases really thrive from the ZK front. But I do know people love ZK. Like if I tweet ZK right now, it'll just get so many views. I don't know why, but people love the concept of ZK.
Just the two characters.
Just Z and K.
Z.
So yeah, I think there is a lot of room for maturity there and growth there. So if anything, my prediction is that there will be more ZK apps and some of them will surprise us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there'll continue to be more developers. I wouldn't be surprised if Solana like still had more new developers next year than Ethereum. But I'm actually, if I can take a really specific prediction, I would say that we will see an increase in multi-chain developers across Solana and Base specifically. I think that like
that's a
Solana
really interesting
developers,
prediction. Yeah.
yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think so, because they're kind of there's a lot of similarities between these two user bases, and I can see applications trying to pull users from both chains.
Wow. So it sounds like we need to have some sort of developer tooling for Base and Solana developers. I like this.
I think there could be there might be a lot of affinity if we look in 1 year's time between Base and Solana.
Love it. And what are your next steps, Maria? Like after creating a report like this, like what do you normally do?
Well, I'm going to end up exploring some of the tech that I've been digging the data on. So yeah, again, exploring some ZK stuff. I want to explore some stuff around AI agents. My like full-time job, my job is making investments. And so, talking to more founders and things like that.
Amazing. Wait, I have one more question before we wrap up. Yeah. I'm curious, because you spend so much time looking at these GitHub repos, do you ever see a project and be like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing idea. I would love to invest in you guys. And you contact them to speak about investing in them?
Yes, this every year I usually encounter repos where I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Like, this is so fascinating. And this year I'm like, man, I really need like a process, right, for tagging these and then like following up with the authors later on. So yeah, that absolutely happens as I'm going through GitHub. I'm like, oh, that's because I think like crypto Twitter is such a small ecosystem at the end of the day. And then when you have any opportunity to expand past that and see other things, you start noticing like, oh, there are like things that people aren't talking about, here. And so, yeah, I definitely see that.
I love it. So developers, you heard it here first. Maria is looking at your repository. Make sure it's public. And you might just be getting a call.
All right. Well, it was so nice to have you on, Maria. This was like such a good conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And thanks for all the great questions. You guys put all the slides together. Really appreciate it. Yeah, such great questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I guess we'll wrap it up.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.